Thank you for joining me as I conclude my examination of the book Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. In this video, I will take a look at the 14th and final chapter of the book, and I will also examine the postscript of the book where Wallace offers some closing thoughts. So let's get started with chapter 14, which is titled, Were They Biased? Wallace begins his consideration of bias with a discussion of motive. He says, quote, "There are two factors at work in a question like this, bias and motive. Were the disciples lying about the resurrection, as Bart Ehrman claims? Were their claims based on religious expectation or bias? If so, what was it that they were hoping to gain from the elaborate lie? If the apostles wanted Jesus to be God, an elaborate lie wouldn't actually accomplish this, at least for the apostles. Lies might fool those who weren't there, but they wouldn't fool those who knew better. What did the apostles hope to gain if their stories were false?" And he's still working from a false dichotomy that assumes the Gospels record either the true testimony of the apostles or the willful lies of the apostles. And it's, of course, possible, and in fact very probable, that neither of those are true, and neither of those possibilities need to be true. There are other explanations for what the Gospels are and where the Gospels come from. They needn't be either the truth as told by the apostles or lies made up by the apostles. Wallace describes the three most common motives for criminal behavior which he encountered during his career as a detective. Perhaps if the apostles did craft an elaborate lie about Jesus, they were acting in accordance with one of these motives. And the three main motives that Wallace identifies are financial greed, when people act to gain money for themselves or to prevent losing money that they already have to somebody else. Sexual or romantic desire, a jealous former lover kills someone because they can't bear to see them with someone else, or they do something with the thought that they might be able to attract a lover that they have coveted for a while. They think if I can get this person out of the way, then I can finally have the person I want. Or pursuit of power. People commit crimes to attain or maintain a position of power or authority. Now, the existence of a motive, Wallace says, doesn't imply guilt. Many people have motives to commit crimes. Right, Audie? Exactly, she agrees with me. Many people have motives to commit crimes, but they don't actually commit the crimes. Still, lack of a motive is often cited by defense attorneys who are presenting a case for the innocence of their client. A defense attorney will jump all over the possibility that their client has never been identified as having a motive for the crime. What do you want? Just a moment. I guess because it's the last episode of this series, she wanted to make a cameo. So say hi to everybody, Audikins. Yes. This is what you wanted, though. Okay. Run away. Run away. Okay, so do any of these three motives apply to the apostles? Well, Wallace examines them one at a time. First, he concludes that the apostles couldn't have been driven by financial gain because the apostles were not wealthy men. They had abandoned their homes and their jobs when they became followers of Jesus. And how do we know this about the apostles? Quote, "There are many ancient accounts describing the lives of the apostles following the period of time recorded in the book of Acts." Let me state once again that the only information we have about the apostles, who they were, what their lives were like, what their motivations were, is found in the New Testament, a collection of texts written from the perspective of someone who believed Jesus was the Son of God and that the apostles were the chosen representatives of Jesus, spreading his message and doing his will. You don't detect any nefarious motives in the apostles as they are depicted in the New Testament. You don't say. Now, Wallace refers to references made to the apostles and their lifestyles in the book of Acts, and also Luke, 1 Corinthians, and the book of James. There are references in all of these books that describe the apostles as choosing a life of material poverty, but that's just using the Bible as evidence that the Bible is true. And it's even worse than that, as I've previously pointed out. It's using the testimony of the apostles as evidence that the apostles are telling the truth. Because remember, Wallace maintains that the New Testament was actually written by the apostles themselves, or at least by their close associates. So is that the technique of a seasoned and unbiased investigator? If a murder suspect told him that he was innocent, would Wallace consider that statement to be evidence of the suspect's innocence? Next, Wallace concludes that the apostles weren't motivated by sexual desires either. According to a few references in the New Testament, plus long-standing church traditions, most of the apostles were married. Also, they seem to have denied themselves sexual contact with their wives after the ascension of Jesus in order to devote themselves entirely to their ministries. Wallace says, quote, "The apostles had a right to bring their wives with them on their journeys, and some may have done so. In any case, it is clear from both the biblical record and the non-biblical history that the apostles were careful to live their sexual lives in a manner that was beyond reproach." The non-biblical history Wallace mentions is comprised of the surviving letters of early church fathers, which were mentioned in previous chapters of the book. People like Clement and Ignatius of Antioch and Tertullian. Only one of those three, Ignatius, would have actually been alive when the apostles were alive and able to know them. And though the letter of Ignatius Wallace cites, which is the letter to the Philadelphians, is generally considered to be authentic, there are scholars, it's a minority opinion, but nonetheless there are scholars who very, very strongly believe that the letters attributed to Ignatius are all forgeries. There is no such thing as an authentic letter written by Ignatius that we still have. So there's no sense in Wallace's writing that he acknowledges this uncertainty when including the letters of Ignatius as part of his clear case for the apostles not being motivated by lust. He's basically relying on what the Bible says about the apostles, which according to him was written by the apostles themselves or their close associates, and a couple of non-biblical letters written by early church fathers, only one of which could possibly have been written by people who actually knew the apostles, and which is considered by some scholars to be a forgery anyway. So his case is incredibly flimsy. Even if we grant Wallace all of his premises and we agree with everything he's saying, the only non-biblical source for the character and the sexual purity, what have you, of the apostles is that one letter that he cites from Ignatius. That's one letter, plus all the stuff in the Bible written by the apostles and their friends. That doesn't form a very compelling case to me. We're being asked to treat as authoritative an account written either by the apostles themselves or by devoted followers of theirs. Is it really surprising that a group which considered sexual purity necessary for moral and spiritual enlightenment would depict the apostles of Christ as chaste and above reproach in matters of sex? Next, to the third major motivation, Wallace concludes that the apostles weren't motivated by a desire for power either, because their lives were far humbler and less influential than the lives of Christian leaders who lived after Christianity became the state religion of Rome in the 4th century. He says, quote, "At this early point in Christian history, leadership within the Christian community was a liability rather than an asset. The non-biblical histories and writings related to the lives and ministries of the 12 disciples consistently proclaimed that the apostles were persecuted and eventually martyred for their testimony." The fetishistic preoccupation with martyrdom is something that is still present in Christian churches today. For many Christians, it seems to be just as fundamental to their faith as their beliefs in the divinity and saving power of Christ. They're taught to perceive themselves as persecuted because of their faith, and they're told stories about great men who bravely faced death because of their faith in Christ. This view of martyrdom as a glorious thing seems to originate with the earliest Christians. So again, it's hardly a surprise that the apostles are depicted as persecuted martyrs rather than people who wielded great political power. Now, I'm not saying that the apostles were people who wielded great political power rather than persecuted martyrs, nor am I saying that they were sex-crazed horn dogs who started a Jesus cult to help them get over with the ladies, nor am I saying that they were definitely seeking financial gain. What I'm saying is that we know practically nothing about who the apostles actually were or what they were actually like. All we have are the stories told about them by people who, for the most part, didn't know them, couldn't possibly have ever met them, and would have been influenced far more by the leaders and cultures of their churches than by anything the apostles themselves said or did. It's possible that the Christian beliefs about the nobility of poverty, the sacredness of chastity, and the glory of martyrdom were influenced by those corresponding qualities of the apostles. It's also possible that those Christian beliefs were influenced by stories about the apostles which weren't actually true. And it's also possible that those aforementioned Christian beliefs came first, and they in turn helped to shape the stories that grew up about the apostles. Wallace's problem is that he is saying that it's definitely that first possibility when there is simply no reason to say that. Wallace concludes that the apostles were free of self-serving motives when they or their associates wrote the New Testament. But if that's the case, he says, why are there still some folks, like your humble presenter here, who reject that conclusion? Why do some people think the apostles must have been biased? Well, one reason is that the New Testament was written by Christians, not by objective eyewitnesses. But, Wallace says, this objection is invalid because the apostles weren't Christians before they met Jesus. They were convinced by the miracles and the message of Jesus. That they began as non-believers in Jesus, even skeptical of Jesus, and wound up devoted followers is actually evidence in favor of the authenticity of the New Testament because it testifies to how convincing and impressive Jesus must have been to have brought around these skeptics and these doubters. Here's the problem. Even if we assume, as Wallace does, that the Gospels were actually written by the apostles or by their associates, the fact that they depict the apostles as skeptics who were convinced by Jesus doesn't prevent them from holding biases that could have rendered their stories unreliable. They may not have been Christians until after they met Jesus, but they didn't write the Gospels until after they met Jesus either. And not only were the Gospels written from a decidedly pro-Jesus perspective by people who called Jesus Lord and worshipped him as a god, they were written for the purpose of glorifying him and convincing more people to follow him. Is it really unreasonable to assume some pro-Jesus bias may have influenced how those stories were told? Is it really more reasonable to insist that the apostles were capable of recognizing and screening out their adoration of Jesus when writing their stories about his life and ministry? Another reason some folks are skeptical of Wallace's conclusions might be that the death narratives of the apostles were also written by Christians and are likely to be biased for the same reasons as the Gospels. Also, many of these stories contain miraculous events. But Wallace says there's no reason to doubt a story just because it depicts miraculous occurrences, unless you have a naturalistic bias, that is. And besides, there are no non-Christian accounts of the deaths of the apostles to contradict the Christian ones, so why shouldn't we accept the Christian accounts? Remember several episodes ago when I told you about that time that I saw Elvis and he was alive and well and buying a pepperoni pizza sub at one of my local Sheets locations? Well, it's been, a few weeks since I first shared that story. And these videos get, several thousand views each. So thousands of people have heard me make that claim that Elvis is alive and I saw him recently buying a pizza sub and a side of sweet potato fries, and no one has yet come forward to contradict that story. Maybe if other people who were at Sheets that day had made competing claims, had said that Elvis was not there, then we could have an argument about it and I'd be forced to present evidence to support my story. But as it stands, the unanimous testimony of people in Sheets that day testifies that Elvis was there, he was alive, and he was hungry. So why wouldn't all of you believe me? because Elvis is dead and dead people don't come back to life? Well, that's just your naturalistic bias. You're ruling out the possibility that Elvis is still alive from the very start. And you call yourselves skeptics. Wallace closes the chapter by returning to his previously stated false dichotomy. Are the Gospels the true testimony of eyewitnesses to the life and ministry of Jesus, or are they lies manufactured by the apostles of Jesus for some nefarious purpose? Those are the only two possibilities Wallace entertains, and naturally he concludes that the first possibility is by far the more likely one, the only one of the two that exhausts all the available evidence. Quote, "We've examined the four important areas that jurors must consider when determining the reliability of eyewitnesses. The most reasonable inference is that the gospel writers were present, corroborated, accurate, and unbiased. If this is the case, we can conclude with confidence that their testimony is reliable. We've done the heavy lifting necessary to determine the reliability of these accounts. We've been diligent and faithful as jurors and have considered the evidence. It's time to make a decision." And that decision is explored in more detail in a postscript following this chapter titled, "Becoming a Two-Decision Christian." Being a two-decision Christian to Wallace means that you not only believe that the Gospels are reliable historical sources, but you also believe in Jesus as the Son of God and the Savior, because that is who the Gospels describe Jesus as being. For Wallace, the first led to the second. Once he was satisfied that the Gospels were historically accurate, he also had to accept that what the Gospels say about Jesus is true. He says, quote, "I knew that my concerns about the Gospels had always been rooted in the miraculous events the accounts described. Philosophical naturalism prevented me from taking miracles seriously. But the apostles claimed to see miracles, and in every way that we typically evaluate eyewitnesses, the gospel authors passed the test." Despite Wallace's repeated insistence in this last section of the book that the Gospels pass the same tests to which eyewitness testimony is subjected in court, I have it on excellent authority that this is simply not the case. I would like now to quote the opinion of someone with a great deal of experience in these matters, veteran homicide detective J. Warner Wallace, who says in Chapter 10 of this very same book, quote, "Some critics attempt to undermine the reliability of the Gospel writers as eyewitnesses, while others seek to have this testimony tossed out as unreliable hearsay before it can be evaluated. They argue that the Gospel accounts fail to meet the judicial standard we require of eyewitnesses in criminal cases. Witnesses must be present in court in order for their testimony to be considered in a criminal trial. This is a reasonable standard to hold for criminal trials, but this standard is simply too much to require of historical eyewitness testimony." Okay, so which is it? Do the Gospels pass the tests applied to court testimony, or would they be tossed out as hearsay? Because Wallace seems to want to have it both ways. If we ignore the fact that they would be considered hearsay and would never be admitted as evidence in a court, they pass the test. If we ignore the factor that would fail them, they pass the test. The fact that I don't think they do pass the test, even if we pretend that they aren't hearsay, is beside the point. As is whether or not the claims in the Gospels are true or not. In this specific instance, the point isn't whether or not the Gospels are true, but the fact that Wallace isn't even putting forward a coherent position. Either we can evaluate the Gospels in the same way courts evaluate eyewitness testimony, or we can't. Wallace admits that we can't, but then he still insists that actually we can, and that when we do, they hold up to scrutiny, if, of course, we ignore the thing that renders them inadmissible in court. Wallace being a detective, I'm disappointed that he doesn't seem to realize the importance of keeping your story straight. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have your Savior and crucify him too. I just thought about it. It might not make sense. To Wallace, Being a two-decision Christian means not only believing in who Jesus is and what he does, but also taking seriously the duty that Jesus assigns you in the Gospels, the Great Commission. He says, quote, "Each of us has to answer God's call on our lives as a two-decision Christian. If you've already decided to believe the Gospels, take a second step and decide to defend them. Become a case-making Christian. Work in your profession, live your life faithfully, devote yourself to the truth, and steadily prepare yourself to make a defense for what you believe. My life as a Christian took flight the minute I decided to become a case-maker. God cleverly used all my experiences as a detective to give me a perspective that I've tried to share with you in the pages of this book. It's my hope that the skeptics who read this might at least lay down their presuppositions long enough to recognize that there is a substantive, circumstantial case supporting the reliability of the gospel writers." That is the final quote from the book that I'll be sharing. I wanted to close this series by returning to this idea that those of us who have rejected Christianity have done so because of our presuppositions, which prevent us from objectively considering the case for Christ, if I may coin a phrase. I don't deny that I have presuppositions. Of course, I have presuppositions, and I don't deny that my presuppositions influence my thinking and compel me to reach certain conclusions. Of course they do. But that doesn't mean my presuppositions are ultimately dogmatic, or that I can't recognize them and set them aside to consider other possibilities. Maybe I'm giving myself too much credit, but I really think that if I were to encounter real, serious evidence for the existence of the supernatural, for example, for the occurrence of miracles, I'd be open to accepting it. If the evidence was there, I could be persuaded. I don't think that's just wishful thinking. There was a time when I was younger and less informed on the subject that I rejected the theory of evolution. I just couldn't see how humans and chimpanzees could share common ancestors, never mind animals even more different from each other than that. A mosquito shares a common ancestor with a redwood tree? That's completely ridiculous. How could I possibly believe that? But see, now I know better. The more I learned, the more my incredulity gave way to understanding. Granted, accepting evolution didn't require me to reevaluate my understanding of how the universe worked on a fundamental level. I accepted evolution well before I identified as an atheist. But I still had a pre-existing bias that I had to overcome, and I did overcome that bias, and I came to hold a belief that at one time I considered unbelievable. So I don't think the problem in my case is that I have presuppositions that are stopping me from giving the evidence a fair hearing. It took some time and it took some study on my part and a willingness to be open-minded, but eventually the evidence for the fact of evolution won me over. The problem is I don't see the evidence for the reliability of the Bible and the truth of Christianity, as J. Warner Wallace is stating it. Christians like Wallace keep pointing at it, insisting that it's there, but I just don't see it. I see what he's pointing at. I perceive what is being presented as evidence. I just don't think it is evidence of what Wallace says it is. The Gospels are there, we agree on that, and we agree on what they say, at least in a literal sense. Our interpretations may differ. But we disagree about what the Gospels are. Wallace insists that they are eyewitness testimony, written by people who knew Jesus, or at least used people who knew Jesus as primary sources, and should therefore be regarded as authorities on the life and teachings of Jesus and his apostles. And claims they make about Jesus and the apostles, including miraculous claims, should be taken seriously and regarded as true. But I find his reasoning unconvincing, and I don't think he's able to explain away the many things that, in my mind and the minds of many other people, not all of whom are atheists, by the way, mark the Gospels as unreliable historical sources. The inconsistencies, the outlandish events they depict that are mentioned nowhere else in historical accounts from the same region and era, the evidence that they were not independently written, but written one after the other with the later Gospels embellishing the earlier. And it would be irresponsible of me as a relative layperson on the subject of the history and composition of the Bible to simply ignore the opinions of biblical scholars, the great majority of whom have rejected Wallace's core arguments for centuries. I wonder, do the Christian scholars and theologians who reject Wallace's simplistic theory of the Bible's origins have a naturalistic bias to overcome? Are the Jewish and Islamic scholars who reject many of the defining claims of Christianity but believe in the miracles recorded in their own scriptures blinded by the philosophical objection to the supernatural? Or might the fault lie, at least partially, in the poor case that Wallace has made, which, in his defense, is the only case that he can make? J. Warner Wallace is a homicide detective, and for all I know, he's a good one. Some of what he's had to say in this book regarding his work in his profession has been eyebrow-raising, such as his disparagement of the value of DNA evidence, but I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt despite that. He may be a fine detective, but no amount of investigative skill can alter the fact that the case for the reliability of the gospel and the divinity of Christ is built on unsubstantiated claims, unwarranted assumptions, and wishful thinking, rather than evidence and reasoned arguments. Throughout the book, Wallace has referred to the events depicted in the Gospels as the crime. That has been one of his central metaphors. If Wallace could bring himself to view that case with the same objectivity and skeptical scrutiny with which I would hope he would pursue a criminal investigation, he might realize that we don't have nearly enough evidence to corroborate the testimony of the so-called eyewitnesses to that crime. In fact, we can't even be sure the crime Wallace has spent this book investigating was committed at all. Well, that concludes the book. That concludes my examination of the book. That's the end of this series, but as regular viewers would expect, I will be starting another series. If you're watching these videos as they are published, it'll be in 2 weeks. I will start the next An Atheist Reads series, and the subject of that series will be the book Atheist Delusions by David Bentley Hart. That will be the next subject of the An Atheist Reads series, Atheist Delusions by David Bentley Hart. So I want to thank you folks for watching this series. I hope that you found it enjoyable. I hope that you found it useful in some way. I'm incredibly gratified that you continue to come back and watch these as I continue to do them. And those of you who are watching this one, and this is your first An Atheist Read series, thank you so much for jumping on board. And if you haven't watched any of the older ones, I invite you to go check out some of the previous ones that I've done. Hopefully you'll find those to be of some use as well, if you found this one to be useful. Thank you all so much, as always, for watching. If you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed this series, please like this video, share it, subscribe to this channel if you're not subbed already. Please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can become a patron of this channel for as little as $1 a month and help me out and help me continue to make videos like this by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives. Thanks again so much to all of you for watching, and I will see you in the next series. Take care, everybody.